The key turned in the lock with a sound that was both familiar and foreign, a metallic sigh of relief after a 5-hour drive. For Marcus Thorne, it was the sound of sanctuary. The old lake cabin, weathered and sturdy, stood as a silent testament to his father's labor and his family's legacy. The air inside was still and carried the faint, comforting scent of pine and memories. He had just set down his duffel bag, the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, when the peace was shattered. Not by a knock, but by a jarring, aggressive pounding on the heavy oak door. It was the kind of knock that wasn't a request, it was a demand, an announcement of authority that brooked no delay. Marcus's heart, which had been settling into a slow, vacation rhythm, instantly hammered against his ribs. His body went still, every sense on high alert. This wasn't a friendly neighbor stopping by with a pie. This was something else. Something hostile. Through the warped glass of the side window, he could see the distorted shapes of 3 men standing on his porch. They were dressed not in casual lake wear, but in polo shirts and khakis, postures rigid with self-importance. He didn't need to see the badges they held ready in their hands to know who they were. The Hawthorne Lakes Homeowners Association. The self-appointed kings of this little domain, his sanctuary suddenly felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in, the familiar shadows now holding a threat. This was a scenario he knew too well, a script written by a society that too often viewed a black man in a nice place as an anomaly, a problem to be corrected. A deep, weary anger began to simmer beneath the surface of his fear, the anger of a man who just wanted to exist in his own space without having to constantly prove he belonged there. He took a slow, steadying breath, his mind racing. He was a professor of history, a man of letters and reason. But reason often had little currency in the face of blind presumption. He walked to the door, his hand hesitating on the cold brass knob. He knew that on the other side waited confrontation, humiliation, the casual cruelty of assumed superiority. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he was not alone. And that the man waiting quietly in the living room, sipping coffee and observing everything, was about to rewrite the entire script. Marcus Thorne had inherited the cabin on Willow Lake 3 years ago. It wasn't a lavish property, but it was priceless. Built by his father's hands in the late 1970s, every beam was nailed with hope, every window framed with the dream of a better life for his family. For young Marcus, summers here were a universe of freedom, fishing off the rickety dock, the smell of his mother's frying pan, the way the lake swallowed the sun each evening in a blaze of orange and purple. It was the one place where the world felt simple and safe. Now, as a 42-year-old tenured history professor, the cabin was his refuge from the exhausting mental labor of his daily life. At Crestmore University, he was Dr. Thorne, a respected academic. But on the long drive from the city to the lake, he could feel that title slowly peel away, layer by layer, mile by mile. By the time he hit the county line, he was just another black man in an older sedan, drawing lingering looks from gas station attendants and fellow drivers. The cabin was where he went to put the pieces of himself back together, to remember who he was beneath the constant, low-grade vigilance he was forced to maintain. This trip was particularly needed. The semester had been grueling, marked not only by the usual academic politics but by a series of subtle, cutting microaggressions. A security guard stopping him, and only him, for his ID every single day despite working there for a decade. A senior colleague questioning, ever so politely, whether his course on post-colonial African states was too niche for the curriculum. The constant, draining pressure to be twice as good for half the recognition. The cabin was his decompression chamber. He'd arrived that afternoon, tired but eager to unwind. He'd air out the rooms, start a pot of coffee, and then just breathe. He had also arranged a meeting. An old friend, David Chen, was in the area and was stopping by. They'd been roommates at law school, two bright-eyed idealists who'd taken very different paths. David had climbed the ladder of public service with a fierce, uncompromising sense of justice, while Marcus had chosen the academy. They hadn't seen each other in person for over a year, and a quiet evening of catching up at the lake was the perfect remedy for his weariness. David had texted he was running 15 minutes late. So Marcus was alone when he first heard the rumble of the golf cart approaching. He saw it through the kitchen window, a gleaming white cart with HLA stenciled on the side in aggressive blue letters. It carried 3 men. The driver was Carl, the HOA's full-time property manager, a man with a perpetual frown and a clipboard that he wielded like a scepter. Beside him was Bill, the retired insurance adjuster and head of the compliance committee, a man who measured grass blades with a ruler. In the back was a younger man Marcus didn't recognize, probably a new volunteer, eager to earn his stripes. Marcus felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. His interactions with the HLA had always been strained. When he'd repainted the cabin's shutters the exact same forest green they'd always been, he'd received a violation notice for unapproved modification. His father had never needed approval. When he'd left his kayak on the dock overnight once, he'd gotten a sternly worded warning about waterfront clutter. Though his white neighbors had their pontoons and jet skis permanently moored, it was a pattern of heightened scrutiny, a presumption of violation. He was always preemptively guilty. He tried to kill them with kindness, with meticulous compliance, but it was a game where the rules changed only for him. He'd considered fighting it, but the emotional tax of that battle seemed even higher than the petty fines. It was easier, or at least less draining, to just sigh, pay the $25 fine, and try to enjoy the peace he'd come forward. He watched the golf cart slow as it passed his driveway. The men's heads turned in unison, scanning his property with the clinical detachment of inspectors on a factory line. He saw Carl's eyes, narrow and assessing, sweep over his car, the freshly swept porch, the neatly stacked firewood. They didn't stop. They continued down the road, and Marcus released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. False alarm. Maybe today would be different. He turned back to making his coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. He allowed himself to relax again, to listen to the gentle lap of the water against the shore. This was why he came here. This was home. He was pouring a cup when he heard the distinct crunch of gravel under tires, much closer this time. He turned to the window. The golf cart was now parked squarely in his driveway. The three men were already marching up the path toward his front door, their expressions grim, their postures rigid with purpose. The knock that followed was not a request for entry. It was a declaration of war. The pounding on the door was a physical force, vibrating through the old wood and into Marcus's bones. It was the sound of his peace being violated, of a boundary being aggressively crossed. For a fleeting second, he considered not answering. He could pretend he wasn't home, but that was the thought of a frightened boy, not a man who owned this house. He was Dr. Marcus Thorne, and he would not cower in his own home. He opened the door, and the afternoon light framed the three men standing on his porch. Carl, the manager, stood front and center, his clipboard held against his chest like a shield. Bill hovered just behind his shoulder, his eyes already performing an invasive scan of the interior behind Marcus. The younger man hung back, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined to follow his leaders. "Afternoon," Carl said, his voice a flat, bureaucratic monotone. It wasn't a greeting. It was an opening statement. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level, consciously layering it with the polite, academic tone he used in faculty meetings. It was a defense mechanism, a way to project calm authority he did not feel. "We've received a complaint," Carl stated, his eyes darting past Marcus into the living room. "A complaint?" Marcus replied, a cold dread beginning to pool in his gut. "Regarding what?" "An unauthorized vehicle in the driveway," Bill piped up, unable to contain himself. "That sedan. It's not on the pre-approved vehicle registry for this property." He pointed an accusatory finger toward Marcus's car, a 5-year-old Toyota he'd owned since he started his job. Marcus almost laughed. It was so absurd it was breathtaking. "That's my car. I've been parking it there for over a decade. My father parked his car there for 30 years before that." Carl consulted his clipboard, a performative gesture. "The registry for Lot 42 only lists a 2008 Ford F-150. That was your father's vehicle." "This vehicle," he said, tapping the clipboard, "is not listed. It's a violation of Covenant 7B, subsection 4. The sheer pettiness of it was a weapon. They knew it was his car. They had seen him drive it for years. This was a pretext, a flimsy excuse to knock on his door and exert their power. "I'll add it to the registry," Marcus said, his jaw tight. He just wanted them to leave. The desire to avoid a scene, to avoid the escalation he knew was their specialty, was overwhelming. "It's not just that," Bill said, leaning forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more offensive than a shout. "A resident reported seeing activity over here earlier. Someone thought they saw a person looking into the windows. We have to check on all reports of potential squatting or break-ins. You understand? For the safety of the community." The air left Marcus's lungs. Squatting. The word hummed between them, toxic and heavy. They were not just accusing him of a paperwork error. They were insinuating he was a criminal, a trespasser in his own home. The carefully constructed facade of civility he maintained began to crack. "Are you asking if I'm breaking into my own cabin?" Marcus asked, his voice low, each word measured and sharp as a blade. "We're asking you to confirm your ownership and your right to be here," Carl said, his tone unchanging. "Standard procedure. Now, if you could step aside, we need to perform a quick interior inspection to confirm no unauthorized persons or violations are present." The demand was so outrageous, so violative, that for a moment Marcus was speechless. They wanted to search his home. Based on a fabricated complaint from a nosy neighbor who saw a black man unlocking a door and assumed the worst. "You want to search my house?" Marcus finally said, disbelief coloring his anger. "It's not a search," Carl corrected, a thin, unpleasant smile on his lips. "It's a compliance inspection. Covenant 22, subsection 1 gives the HLA board the right to inspect any property for maintenance, safety, or covenant violations. It's all right here in the bylaws you agreed to." He held up the clipboard as if it were a holy text. Marcus knew this tactic. They buried their power to harass in pages of legalese, counting on most people not having the time, money, or energy to fight it. They were bullies with a lawyer on retainer. "I know the bylaws," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "And I know my rights. You have no authority to enter my home without my permission, and you certainly don't have it. This ends now. Get off my porch." The direct challenge changed the atmosphere. Carl's fake neutrality evaporated, replaced by a flush of irritation. Bill puffed out his chest. The young man looked at his feet. "Your refusal to comply is noted," Carl said coldly. "This will result in an immediate fine of $200 for obstruction. We'll also be issuing citations for the unregistered vehicle and the unkempt landscaping." He gestured vaguely toward a single dandelion growing near the porch step. It was a cascade of manufactured violations, a punishment for his defiance. Marcus felt a hot, impotent rage wash over him. He was an educated man, a homeowner, a taxpayer. Yet in their eyes, he was just a problem to be managed. His history, his legacy, his deeds, none of it mattered. Only the color of his skin did. "Get off my property," Marcus repeated, his hand gripping the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned white. It was then that he saw the headlights. A dark, unremarkable sedan was rolling slowly down the lake road. It signaled and turned into his driveway, coming to a stop behind the golf cart. David was here. The arrival of a second car broke the standoff. The HOA men turned, their curiosity piqued. Who was this? Another unauthorized person. David Chin got out of the car. He was dressed casually in khakis and a windbreaker, but he carried himself with an innate, unshakable authority. He closed the car door and looked at the scene on the porch, his friend, visibly angry and tense, confronting three aggressive men. His eyes, sharp and perceptive, took in the entire picture in a nanosecond, the body language, the clipboard, the golf cart of authority. He walked toward the porch, his expression neutral but his gaze intense. "Marcus," he said, his voice calm. "Everything all right here?" The HOA men saw a well-dressed Asian man and seemed to recalculate slightly. Their brand of bullying was often selectively applied. "This is a private HLA matter, sir," Carl said, turning his clipboard toward David as if it were a badge. "We're conducting a compliance inspection." David ignored him completely, his eyes fixed on Marcus. "Marcus?" he asked again, his tone gentle but insistent. He needed to hear it from his friend. The dam broke. The humiliation, the frustration, the deep-seated weariness of a lifetime of these small, corrosive encounters, it all surged to the surface. Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke to David, was thick with a raw emotion he usually kept buried. "They received a report of someone breaking in," Marcus said, the words tasting like ash. "They want to search my house to make sure I'm not a squatter. And they're finding me for my own car being in my own driveway." David listened, his face a stoic mask. But Marcus could see a storm gathering behind his eyes. He knew that look. It was the look David got right before he eviscerated a faulty argument in a courtroom or dismantled a corrupt policy in a legislative hearing. David finally turned to face the three men. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence seemed to expand, filling the space around them. "I see," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you gentlemen are from the Homeowners Association?" "That's correct," Carl said, emboldened by what he perceived as a new, more reasonable audience. "We're just doing our jobs, ensuring the community standards are upheld." "Mr. Thorne here is being uncooperative." "His name," David said, the words dropping like stones, "is Dr. Thorne." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "And your job does not include violating the Fourth Amendment rights of a property owner based on a racially profiled hunch. Your community standards seem to have a very specific, and very ugly, application." Bill spluttered, turning red. "Now you see here. Who do you think you are?" David Chin offered a small, cold smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Why don't you come inside?" he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more threatening than any shout. "Let's all have a conversation about standards. And consequences." He didn't wait for their answer. He turned, placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder, and guided his stunned friend back into the cabin. After a moment's hesitation, driven by confused indignation and a need to regain control, the three HOA men followed them inside, crossing the threshold into a reckoning they could never have foreseen. The inside of the cabin was a stark contrast to the tension that had just polluted its porch. Warm, wood-paneled walls were lined with bookshelves and framed family photos spanning decades. A worn but comfortable leather sofa sat before a stone fireplace. The air still held the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was the very picture of a cherished, lived-in family home. The three HOA men stood awkwardly in the entryway, their self-importance seeming to shrink in the cozy, domestic space. They were intruders here, and on some level, they felt it. Carl's eyes continued their invasive scan, but now it felt desperate, searching for anything, a smudge on the window, a rug askew, to justify their presence. David walked calmly to the coffee pot and poured 2 mugs. He handed one to Marcus, who took it numbly, his body still thrumming with adrenaline and humiliation. The simple, mundane act of a host offering coffee to his guest was a powerful reassertion of normality, of ownership. This was Marcus's space. David was his guest. These other men were the interlopers, now, David said, turning to face them. He leaned against the kitchen counter, cradling his mug. He looked utterly at ease. "Let's discuss this inspection. You're concerned about unauthorized persons." He gestured with his free hand around the room. "As you can see, it's just Dr. Thorne and myself. Are we sufficient to trigger your concerns? Or is your issue specifically with his presence in his own home?" Carl, trying to regain the upper hand, cleared his throat. "The issue, sir, is procedure. All guests must be registered 24 hours in advance. We have no record of a guest for this property today. That's another violation." He made a note on his clipboard, the scratch of the pen obscenely loud in the quiet room. David didn't even glance at the clipboard. "I'm not a guest. I'm a friend visiting a friend. I don't need to be registered. This isn't a correctional facility. It's a private residence. The covenants apply to everyone," Bill snapped, his patience gone. "The rules are the rules. He agreed to them when he bought the place." "Did he?" David asked, his head tilting. "Or did he inherit this property, along with the membership? And have you, in the last 3 years, provided him with a current, updated copy of these bylaws you're so fervently citing?" Or are you enforcing a document he's never formally agreed to? Carl blinked. It was a small, precise legal point, and it had landed. That doesn't negate the vehicle violation. Or the refusal to allow a safety inspection. The safety inspection you demanded based on a report of suspicious activity, David continued, his voice like smooth steel. Tell me, what exactly constituted this suspicious activity? Did the report specify? Was it the act of unlocking a door? Or was it simply the presence of a black man performing that act? The question, so bluntly stated, sucked the air out of the room. The young man in the back looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Bill's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Carl's face tightened. We don't make decisions based on race, Carl said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed, don't you? David pushed off from the counter and took a single step forward. The movement was small, but it made all three men tense. Let's conduct a little experiment. Let's pull the HLA violation records for the last 5 years. Let's run the addresses and the names of the homeowners. I'd be willing to make a significant wager on a statistical anomaly. I'd bet my annual salary that the 3 properties owned by non-white families on this lake, the Jacksons, the Garcias, and Dr. Thorne here, have received a disproportionate number of citations and complaints compared to the other 97 properties. Would you care to prove me wrong? Silence. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Carl would not meet his eyes. He knew it was true. They all knew it was true. It was a system of quiet terror, enforced by petty fines and social pressure, designed to make certain families feel unwelcome, to grind them down until they sold and left. This is ridiculous, Bill blustered, turning to Marcus. We don't have to stand here and be insulted. The fines stand. We'll see you at the hearing next month. Bring your friend. He spat the last word. They turned to leave, their retreat a desperate scramble to escape the uncomfortable truth David was weaving around them. I wouldn't leave just yet, David said. His voice had changed. The calm, conversational tone was gone, replaced by something absolute, something final. It was the voice of a man used to being listened to, a voice that carried the weight of real authority. The men froze at the door. You came here to perform an inspection based on alleged safety concerns, David said, walking slowly toward the center of the room. You invoked your rules. Now, I'd like to invoke mine. He reached into the inner pocket of his windbreaker. For a wild moment, Marcus thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he produced a simple, black leather wallet. He flipped it open, holding it up for the 3 men to see. Inside was a gold badge, gleaming under the warm cabin lights. Next to it was an identification card with his photograph and official seal. My name is David Chen, he said, and each word was like a hammer strike. I am the Attorney General for the state of New York. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Carl's face went from flushed to a deathly pale. The clipboard slipped from his numb fingers and clattered on the hardwood floor. Bill took an involuntary step backward, as if he'd been physically pushed. His jaw went slack, all his bluster evaporating into pure, undiluted terror. The young man simply looked like he was going to be sick. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the pulse throbbing in Bill's temple. My office, David continued, his voice cold and precise, has a civil rights bureau. Its mandate is to investigate precisely this kind of behavior, the systemic, discriminatory harassment of homeowners based on their race, color, or national origin. It seems, gentlemen, that in your zeal to enforce lawn length and approved paint colors, you may have inadvertently violated state and federal fair housing laws. He paused, letting the scale of their catastrophic error sink in. They weren't facing a petty fine anymore. They were facing the full, terrifying power of the state. Your compliance inspection is now over, David said, snapping the wallet shut. The sound made all 3 men flinch. Mine is just beginning. I will be personally reviewing every single bylaw, every fine, every complaint, and every hearing transcript the Hawthorne Lakes Association has produced in the last decade. I will be subpoenaing your financial records and your meeting minutes. And I will be speaking with every single one of your minority homeowners. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze unforgiving. You thought you were the authority here. You were mistaken. You will each receive a formal letter from my office within the week. It will instruct you to retain your own legal counsel and to preserve all association records. You are now the subjects of a state investigation. He walked to the front door and opened it wide. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust still hanging in the air from the shaking clipboard. Get out of my friend's house, he said, his voice low and terrifyingly calm. And I suggest you prepare for the consequences of your actions. They will be considerably more expensive than a $25 fine. Without a word, without even looking up, the three men filed out. Their shoulders were slumped, their earlier arrogance completely obliterated. They shuffled to their golf cart, a pathetic procession of defeated bullies, and drove away in a silence that was louder than any argument. Marcus stood in the center of his living room, watching them go. The rage and humiliation that had been boiling inside him had been replaced by a stunned, overwhelming sense of vindication. He looked at his old friend, who had just wielded the full force of his office not for a political win, but for a personal justice. David closed the door, shutting out the world. The sanctuary had been reclaimed. He turned to Marcus, the formidable attorney general mask melting away to reveal the concerned friend beneath. Now, David said, a slight, weary smile finally touching his lips. How about that coffee? The following weeks at Willow Lake were unlike any Marcus had ever experienced. The silence that descended was no longer just the absence of sound, it was a profound, palpable peace. The fear of the golf cart's rumble was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that his sanctuary was truly his own. The letters from the Attorney General's office arrived, as promised, by certified mail. They were not bluffs. The investigation into the Hawthorne Lakes Association began with the quiet, methodical force of a glacier, slow, inevitable, and capable of reshaping the entire landscape. Carl was immediately suspended by the HOA's panicked board of directors. Bill resigned from the compliance committee, citing health reasons. The association's lawyer, who had once sent Marcus terse letters about dandelions, was now on a frantic, round-the-clock conference call with the state's prosecutors, trying to mitigate the damage. The change among Marcus's neighbors was stark and telling. Where once there were averted glances and cold shoulders, there were now hesitant, overly friendly waves from across the water. A few even came by to check on him, offering awkward apologies for any misunderstanding and blaming everything on an overzealous committee. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but Marcus merely nodded, accepting their nervous pleasantries with a detached grace. He understood their fear. It was a currency they finally recognized, but the real victory wasn't in the schadenfreude of his tormentors' panic. It was in the phone calls. First, it was Mr. Garcia, 2 cabins down. Marcus had only ever exchanged brief nods with him. His voice on the phone was thick with emotion. Dr. Thorne? I just got a call from the Attorney General's office. They asked me about my experiences with the HOA. I told them everything. The fines for our patio furniture, the complaints about our music during a family party. I thought it was just us. I thought we were doing something wrong. Thank you. Gracias. Then, it was Miss Jackson, an elderly widow who lived on the North Shore. Her voice was frail but fierce. Marcus, honey? That nice man from the state government came to see me. He had a badge and everything. I told him about how they harassed my Henry before he passed, always saying his boat was too noisy. Henry built that boat with his own hands. They just didn't like seeing a black man with a brand new bass boat. I finally got to tell someone. Thank you, child. You've given an old woman her voice back. With each call, Marcus's personal vindication grew into something larger. It was no longer just about his porch, his car, his humiliation. It was about a pattern, a disease that had infected this beautiful place for years, and he and David had been the catalyst for its exposure and treatment. He had not been crazy. He had not been paranoid. The injustice was real, measurable, and now, it was being addressed. One evening, as the fireflies began their dance over the lake, Marcus sat on the porch with David, who was up for a weekend visit. The investigation was ongoing, but the outcome was clear. The HLA would be dissolved and restructured under a state-appointed monitor, its discriminatory covenants stripped away and replaced with a fair, equitable code. It never should have taken the Attorney General showing up on my doorstep, Marcus said quietly, staring out at the darkening water. It never should have required that kind of power to just be left in peace. David sipped his beer. The law is a tool, Marcus. Sometimes it's a scalpel for precise work. Sometimes it's a sledgehammer to break down a rotten door. They needed a sledgehammer. But what about everyone who doesn't have a sledgehammer? Marcus asked, the weight of the question hanging in the air. What about the Marcus Thornes who are stopped for driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood? Or followed in a department store? Or who have to have the talk with their sons about how to act around police? They don't have the state attorney general in their living room. They just have the fear. They just have the humiliation. And then they have to swallow it, again and again, just to get through the day. David was silent for a long time. You're right, he finally said. This was a battle won, not the war. This system, it's designed to be exhausting. It's designed to make resistance so costly, emotionally, financially, spiritually, that most people simply give up. That's its greatest strength. What happened here wasn't a solution. It was an exception, a rare, beautiful, and satisfying exception, but an exception nonetheless. Marcus nodded. The victory was sweet, but it was also a reminder of how deep the roots of injustice ran. True change wouldn't come from a single dramatic confrontation, no matter how satisfying. It would come from the tedious, unglamorous work of changing hearts and minds, of rewriting laws and challenging biases every single day, even when there was no audience, no badge, no dramatic climax. He thought of his father, building this cabin beam by beam, creating a legacy with his own hands. His struggle had been against the elements, against the weight of the wood and the stubbornness of the land. Marcus's struggle was different. It was against a more insidious force, the quiet, smiling, clipboard-wielding assumption that he was less than, that he didn't belong. This cabin was more than a building. It was a testament. A testament to his father's labor and to his own refusal to be forced out. The story of what happened here would become part of its legacy, a new layer of history laid over the old. The system had banked on his weariness. It had bet that he would choose peace over principle. For a while, he had. But in the end, the principle had found him, in the form of an old friend with a badge and an unwavering sense of right and wrong. As the stars emerged over the lake, mirroring the fireflies below, Marcus felt a new sense of resolve settle over him. His sanctuary was secure. But his work was just beginning. His classroom was his arena. His voice, his weapon. He would teach this story, not as a singular event, but as a symptom of a much larger sickness. And he would challenge his students, and himself, to find their own sledgehammers, their own scalpels, their own voices to fight the quiet, everyday injustices that too many are forced to simply swallow. The cabin had always been his refuge. Now, it was also his monument. A monument to the truth that sometimes, just sometimes, the system doesn't just get busted, it gets busted by the one person it never saw coming, and it makes you wonder, how many other doors are being pounded on right now? And who, if anyone, is waiting on the other side?